Leanne, and the word appropriation doesn't appear in the bill except a couple of places in one section, and it's really referring to some other appropriation. So if he vetoes that, that'll be new ground. Big new ground. I'm going to talk about partial vetoes also. But that bill is not an appropriation bill, and the partial veto authority goes to appropriation bills only. So that will be a battle that will probably be fought in the courts. Got the sound? Good deal. Okay. Well, like I said, I'm going to talk to you about various aspects of the appropriation bills, requirements, what can be done, what cannot be done, and then we're going to look at some examples. Some of this is going to be basic to y'all. We've got several new people, so I'm going to go back to the basics, start with that, and then get more detailed. But there should be something in this for everybody. I wanted to start with putting appropriation bills in context because there are several types of bills that the legislature passes every year, each having its own purpose and function. General bills, revenue bills, appropriation bills, local and private bills, and suffrage bills. Some of them are pretty obvious from their name, local and private bills and suffrage bills. General bills are the broadest type. They're the most numerous, and they're also broadest in scope of what can be included in them and what they can do. The legislature, I forgot to mention, the legislature also passes resolutions, but we're not going to talk about those because they're not relevant to appropriation bills. And there's a term that we use, collective term, to refer to bills and resolutions, and it's measures. So if you say the legislature, how many measures did the legislature pass? That includes bills and resolutions. But other than general bills, the other type bills are special types of bills. They're more limited in scope than general bills. When the legislature passes any bill, the bills become laws, but not all bills are the same. Like I mentioned about general bills, they're the most broadest in scope, and the others are special type bills with more limited scope. So they're all laws, but they're not all equal. Okay, appropriation bill, that's what we're here for. So what is it? What does it do? What can be done by it? What can be included in it? And in what ways is it more limited than a general bill? An appropriation bill is the authorization to spend money out of the state treasury. Simply put, it is spending authority that is given to an agency or official. And I hear y'all say that all the time. That's a good way to think about it. You talk about a program that you have or money in an account, and you say, well, they can spend it. No, they don't have spending authority. A member asked me, I won't tell you who it is, but a member of the Appropriations Committee asked me, we had a bill, general bill, creating a special fund in the state treasury, and he said, what is the state treasury? And I was a little surprised because I thought it was kind of obvious, but the state treasury is really like the big bank. It's the general fund, which is primarily, by far, the biggest part of the state treasury, and a number of special funds. But that's the state treasury, and an appropriation bill is an authorization to spend money from the treasury. There are a few bills where appropriation bills authorize money to be spent out of bank accounts that aren't in the treasury. The only ones I've seen, there may be some others, Leanne, but are these water districts, these big water districts. And they actually use different wording. They don't say appropriated, they say it's approved for expenditure. So maybe you could say those still aren't technically an appropriation bill, because in my mind, an appropriation bill is appropriating out of the state treasury. Okay, I've already touched on this, but just because money is in a fund in the treasury and the law authorizes that fund to be administered by an agency or an official, does not mean that the agency or official has the authority to spend that money. To be authorized to spend the money, there must be spending authority, which is given in an appropriation bill. Let's go to our first handout. We're going to look at the requirements. This is the one about, you see the section 63, Mississippi Constitution. There are a few provisions of the Constitution that apply to appropriation bills. Some of them you are aware of. You may not have known they were in the Constitution, but the first one numerically is section 63, and appropriation bills have to have a maximum sum. You can't just say that any money that they get is appropriated. When I was reviewing the bills, I told you earlier, I was looking at the bills in the summer way back, and I noticed that for federal funds, it just said that for any federal funds we receive, they're approved. And I did a lot of research and found out that all federal funds, I think this is still true, are deposited in the state treasury. And so they are appropriated. And so you need to be constitutional, you have to have a maximum sum. Even on escalations, now that's technically not an appropriation, but it is. I mean, it authorizes the spending authority that we're talking about. And I have told analysts that if you authorize money to be escalated, put a maximum sum. Now, you can't spend more than you have. So estimate what you think it'll be and then add and double it or whatever, but just put a figure in there that money could be escalated not to exceed $5 million. So that's one thing, a maximum sum has to be specified. Section 64, we hear that a lot. We say an appropriation bill is 1 year or 18 months. You hear about an 18-month appropriation bill. They're technically not 18 months, but if a bill is effective on passage and it's effective through the end of the next fiscal year, it'll be more than a year. If you look at that language, it says the longest period it can be effective is 2 months after the expiration of the fiscal year, ending after the meeting of the legislature at its next regular session. So instead of June 30th, it could actually go to September 30th. And I know that that's used as a closeout period, but you could actually have the spending authority through September 30th, but no longer according to Section 64 of the Constitution. If you flip over to the next page, Section 68, you've seen that the appropriation bills and revenue bills have special calendars, and they get precedence over all other business. So if you're on the general calendar and they want to go to the appropriations calendar, they can jump back over to that. And then that last phrase, no such bill shall be passed during the last 5 days of the session, that's the 5-day rule that we hear about that required the extension of the session this year. We call that extension on paper because it doesn't necessarily require you to be here 5 more days, but it allowed those bills to be passed, appropriation bills and revenue bills to be passed near the end of the session. 5 days from the original sine die, which was April the 3rd, would go back to, you count backwards, and it would go through Wednesday. Sine die was on a Sunday before it was extended. You go back through Wednesday, and so no appropriation bill could have been passed after Tuesday. So you had to have the authority to pass those bills later in the week, so the session was extended to do that. Now this is a big section, Section 69. People have asked us over the years, why do we have so many appropriation bills? Can't we just have one big budget bill like they have in other states? Well, I didn't underline it, but you look at the first sentence. General appropriation bills shall contain only the appropriations to defray the ordinary expenses of the executive, legislative, and judicial departments, pay interest on state bonds, and support the common schools. All other appropriation bills shall be made by separate bills, each embracing but one subject. We don't have any definition of what general appropriation bills are. People have done research over it. I have too for years. There's no court cases on it. There's no writings on it. I did some research one time to see what was done. I looked in the House journals back in the early 1900s to see what was done in appropriation bills, which would have been done by people who were still alive when the 1890 Constitution was adopted. So there were more than one agency in an appropriation bill. but they were mostly the statewide elected officials, and they were very small compared to, I mean, what the appropriations for them were very small. They had like 3-line items for each one of them. They had for the official, for secretarial staff, and for equipment or something like, or supplies. But there were about 7 or 8 that were in there, and maybe 10. And over the years, there have been some that have been combined, but just keep in mind that it's best, and because of this, you're not supposed to put more than one agency in an appropriation bill. In other words, you can't have Division of Medicaid, DHS, Department of Health. If you do, you run afoul of this section. And I'll mention it later, but the partial veto case that came up in 2020, the court did mention that there were 5 agencies in that. I drafted that bill, and I had some doubts about it when I did it. The chairman wanted to have them all in one bill, so I went ahead with it. But anyway, just keep in mind if somebody says, oh, can we put community colleges in with IHL? Well, you shouldn't do that. You should have a separate bill. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do a lot of different things for one agency in the bill. You can do just about anything you want to with the health department. This year, policy decision was made by the staff primarily and the leadership to keep the ARPA bills separate. But you could have put those in the annual funding bill for those agencies. But it still would be the same agency. You don't have to have separate bills for each, for federal funds or for special funds or whatever. They can all be put in the same bill as long as it's the same agency. Now, the last sentence in here is the big part, though. Legislation shall not be grafted on the appropriation bills, but the same may prescribe the conditions on which the money may be drawn and for what purpose is paid. We're going to get into that more, but basically, you know, I was telling you appropriation bills are special type bills limited in scope, and it means that you can't put general legislation in an appropriation bill. And people do that a lot, and they think that it's a bill, it's a law. Why can't you do it? Especially new analysts don't know the difference, and they say, well, it's a law. It looks like a law. It's signed by the governor. Why can't you do that? You can't do that because of Section 69. And I'll show you ways, I'm going to show you ways where you can, if you have something you want to do, where you can probably do it as long as you write it as a condition. But if you write it as just this agency shall do this and shall not do that, then it probably runs afoul of this engrafting provision. All right, flip over to the next page, Section 73. The governor may veto parts of an appropriation bill and approve parts of the same, and the portions approved shall be law. I'm going to go into that in more detail later. And then on the next page is Joint Rule 20A, which has some limitations on floor amendments on appropriation bills that deal with the general fund and state support special funds. I'm going to get into that later also. Okay. Just to review what I've said, conditions in appropriation bills, it's not constitutional to engraft legislation and appropriation bills, but it may be possible to write what you want to do as a condition. If the language is a condition, then it would not be engrafting. Now, I'm going to show you a lot of examples, and y'all are all familiar with language that says it is the intention of the legislature that something be done or not, something not be done. That language is not engrafting, but that's because it's not binding, and that's the problem with it too. Using conditional language is the best way to write it, but let me mention too, if you are talking about spending money and you say that this agency, DEQ, shall spend money for something or shall spend a set dollar amount or shall not spend money for something, there is no reason to say it's the intent of the legislature that they do that or not do that, because that's allowable. You can say how they spend the money. Just say they shall not spend the money. They shall spend the money. If you're talking about spending money, don't say it's the intent of the legislature. That's a weaker sounding It also is not binding. It's not binding, and you want it to be binding. There are, I'll show you some examples later about why you probably have to do it, because it's really hard to write as a condition, and members tell you to put things in bills that you have to do because they want it in there. The agencies, I think I skipped something that's in your handout. I was getting ahead of myself. I'm going to talk about it, but it's in this handout here. Let's go to this handout here. Just the heading appropriation bills, and I'll read some of it, not all of it, but some of it we've talked about. Appropriation bills, what are they? They're special type bills, provide funds from the Treasury to officials and agencies and authorize them to spend those funds during a certain period of time. The money will come from either the general fund or a special fund in the Treasury, and the source of the funds must be specified in the bills. Okay, parts of an appropriation bill. There are three essential parts. First, the recipient of the funds. Who are you appropriating the money to? Second, the purpose for which the funds are appropriated. And third, the maximum amount of funds that may be expended, required by Section 63 of the Constitution. Another part, it's not essential, but you can have conditions, as I've mentioned. Time limitation. Appropriation bills are limited in time. We saw that in Section 64. Generally, they go into effect on July 1. We have additionals that are in deficits that go into effect on passage. Internally, as you know, the appropriation bills right before the dollar amounts, you say for the fiscal year beginning on July 1 and ending June 30th. As I mentioned, you could actually have that go through September 30th, but if you limit it internally, it does not go through September 30th. It goes through that ending date. The engrafting prohibition that we looked at in Section 69, it may be possible to write it as a condition. If it's a condition, it would not be engrafting. The conditional language, it can be written as a condition precedent. Now, that word looks like precedent, but it's a legal term, condition precedent to the spending of funds. I'll tell you about that in a second. Or a restriction on the spending of funds. For instance, if a member wants to require an agency to do something, the language could say that the agency is not authorized to spend any of the funds appropriated in the bill until the agency has taken that action. And that's regardless of whether any of the funds are spent in taking that action. That's a condition precedent. It means they have to do something first before they get the money. Precedent, means precede. It comes from the word precede. If a member wants to restrict an agency from taking certain action, the language could say that none of the funds that are appropriated may be spent by the agency for the purpose of taking that action. If a member wants to limit the amount of funds that an agency spends for a certain purpose, the language could say that not more than X amount may be spent by the agency for that purpose. Or you could do it also a minimum amount. The agency shall spend not less than a certain amount for that purpose. Now, this is the key thing, and a lot of people, even our attorneys in our office, don't know this. It tells you an appropriation bill is a law, but it's limited in what you can do. And Leanne, you see this a lot too. We saw one where people said, well, we can just create that program in the appropriation bill. And we say, no, you can't. An appropriation bill is not a general bill. An appropriation bill cannot give an agency or an official the power to take any action that the agency or official does not already have the power to do under its statutory or constitutional authority. So an appropriation bill can only authorize the official or the agency to spend funds for a purpose that the agency or official already has by the statute or by the Constitution. Now, that doesn't have to be specific. You're not going to see all the programs of the State Department of Health in the appropriation bill. Hey, Anna, we're on this part right here on appropriation bills, just going over that. But there has to be at least general authority. And when you look at the State Department of Health, State Division of Medicaid, they have broad authority to do things in their statutory authority. But you have to be careful about creating a program. First of all, it has to be written as a condition. You can't just say they shall create a program. But for our purposes as attorneys, if a member comes to our office and requests us to draft an appropriation bill, I've told our attorneys the first thing you need to do is make sure the agency has the authority to do something like that, either general or specific. And if they don't, then we need to write up a separate bill, a general bill doing that. I'll give you an example. This year, Missy McGee asked me to draft a bill to provide appropriation of ARPA funds to authorize hospitals to expand their capacity because of COVID, to take care of COVID patients. And so I did, but it kind of bothered me up until the deadline. I kept thinking, well, I think I probably need a general bill. And at the last minute, I wrote up a general bill for her and put it in. And her bill passed the House. The bill died in the Senate because the Senate had a similar bill, a general bill, and they went with the general bill that did provide ARPA funds for expansion of the capacity of hospitals. But, you know, she had asked for $20 million for the health department to develop a program to do that. And so it might be able to be done. You could write it as a condition. You might be able to say the health department has broad authorities, but I don't think they have the authority to create a lot of those programs on their own. They need general bill authority to do so. So anyway, that is something that keep in mind. I know, William, you're the only attorney on the staff, but I think that, so y'all aren't going to necessarily analyze it like we do in the drafting office, but just keep in mind, again, appropriation bills are limited. You can't put substantive provisions in the law unless they're conditions. And even if it's a condition, I don't think you want to be creating programs in appropriation bills. Attached to this, I've got just a form. Whenever I get a request to do an appropriation bill, I have that saved in my drafting directory. And you can see, we'll look at those. I left blanks about who it's appropriated to, the purpose. I've got the fiscal year, but it's either the current fiscal year or effective on passage. And then section 2 we call the payout clause. It's really a section, but we've always been called a clause as long as I've been here. And then I have principles to remember when drafting amendments to the appropriation bill. I'm not going to read those now because I'll show you some examples later, but those are really good to remember, good overview and outline of what can be done and what can't be done in as a condition. Okay, there's a bill, probably Rob and Corbin are the only ones that see it, but there's a bill every year that we have transfer bill, but then we have, I think, Rob, we started calling it a transfer corrections bill. It's really correcting or making changes to current fiscal year appropriation bills. And it's changing some of the language and conditions, a variety of things that are done. Sometimes it is transferring money. They used to be used a lot when you had major objects of expenditure in, and you'd be transferring from one major object of expenditure to another. But when you look at them, they look like appropriation bills or parts of appropriation bills. And they are parts of appropriation bills, but they're amending the current fiscal year's appropriation. And if the money, if the spending authority is not increased, now there might be some dollar figures underlined and look like they're new, and they are new, but if the total amount authorized to be expended by that appropriation bill does not increase, then it is not an appropriation bill. It is a general bill, It's a general bill for deadline purposes, and it's a general bill for voting purposes. So if you find something, and even after it's introduced, those provisions can be added to the bill, and we generally do that at the end. I've got maybe the first page of one of these attached in my examples that I'll show you. Okay, transfers. Y'all hear about transfers all the time. What are transfers, and how's it different from an appropriation bill? A transfer is the movement of money from one fund to another fund in an appropriation bill. When a bill transfers money into a special fund in the Treasury, can the agency spend it? No, because a transfer is not spending authority. It does not authorize the money to be spent. Think of it this way. A transfer is movement of funds within the Treasury, while appropriations are movements of funds out of the Treasury. And so I kind of envision it that way, like the Treasury's here and it's moving back and forth here. If it's not coming out of the Treasury, it's not an appropriation bill. If it comes out of the Treasury, if it's authorized to come out of the Treasury, it will be an appropriation bill. Okay, transfers, since they cannot and do not authorize expenditure of funds from the Treasury, they cannot be put into a general bill, an appropriation bill. Transfers instead must be in general bills. And Rob, we said we have two transfer bills. We always have those introduced. And we usually save for conference about the transfers that we need and put those in as necessary to coordinate with the appropriations that have been passed or are going to be passed at the end of the session. So we can't combine or mix and match appropriation bill provisions and general bill provisions. Code sections cannot be part of an appropriation bill. So you'll see sometimes, well, can't we put that in an appropriation bill? No, or if you have a bill with code sections or general bill provisions, you can't put appropriation bill provisions into those bills either. Some states, and we see this a lot, we have members ask us to look at a law in another state. And we look at the bill, it creates a new program, and at the end, the last section of the bill, or next to last before the effective date, says that a certain amount of money shall be appropriated to fund this program. Well, that's pretty convenient, but we can't do that. Members would love to have, a lot of members would love to have it all in one bill. And we say, no, it has to be a separate appropriation bill. And that's because of Section 69 that prohibits engrafting of general legislation into appropriation bill. That's why we can't create a new program in a general bill and include the funding for the program in the bill. The creation of the program and the funding, meaning the spending authority, must be in separate bills. Now, the source of the funding could be in the general bill. You could have a tax in the general bill, you could have fees, but that, even though the source is in the general bill, you still can't, the agency still can't spend it until they have spending authority for that in the appropriation bill, a separate bill. And we saw that a lot this session. There were a number of new programs. I already mentioned one, Missy McGee's program that passed actually as a Senate bill, so it wasn't her bill, but new programs were created in general bills, and they were going to be funded with ARPA funds. But the ARPA fund, the appropriation of the ARPA funds was in separate standalone appropriation bills. That's where the actual funding for the programs was. Probably Leanne's more familiar with this, but I did want to mention it. A lot of these ARPA program bills that were created, a lot of people, and we do it, the attorneys do it a lot of times, the agency, the member wants to see a special fund created for that program. So you have a program and you create a special fund for that program, and all monies to fund that program will go in the special fund. Well, we had a lot of ARPA programs created, and we had special funds, and early on, we were going to keep up with all those special funds, and at the end, in our transfer bill, we were going to transfer money into the special funds and then have appropriations of those those special funds in the appropriation bills. And it just got to be so many that Leanne and others were concerned that we'd miss some, and there's not really an advantage for having a special fund. Why not just appropriate the ARPA funds directly to the agency? So we went back and all of them that we could, we took the special funds out of the program bills and just had the ARPA money appropriated directly to the agencies. Because if you have like I said earlier, if you have a special fund, agency may say, well, I want that special fund dedicated to our program, but however the money gets into the fund, you still have to have it appropriated, so it does not give them an advantage. It gives them an advantage in one case. If you have money that's specifically earmarked or diverted to that fund, if you have like a diversion of the sales tax goes into that fund or certain fees collected go into that fund, well, the agency loves that because they don't have to fight for their piece of the pie, the big general fund pie. That's what the infamous sweep bill was designed to do in 2362 in 2016. It didn't work because it's so limited in the number of agencies that it covers, and it gets fewer every year. But the idea was you'd eliminate a lot of special funds. All the money would go into the big pie of the special fund, and every agency and official would have to come to the legislature and justify and fight for their piece just like everybody else, rather than having money set aside in a special fund that they couldn't spend without an appropriation bill, but on the other hand, nobody else could spend it unless it was transferred out, which is sometimes done. Let me mention briefly that Joint Rule 20A. It's at the back of the handout with the constitutional sections. 20A was adopted by the legislature in the Joint Rules in the 2012 session. And the press criticizes it pretty heavily. I'll tell you why in just a second, but I'll tell you what it does first. It says that if an amendment is offered on the floor, doesn't apply in committee, doesn't apply in conference, doesn't apply at any stage of the process except on the floor when House is considering House-originated bills and the Senate is considering Senate-originated bills, appropriation bills. But if an amendment is offered that would increase the amount of state support special funds, then the amendment also has to decrease the amount of state support special funds to another agency's budget. So it's meant to keep the amendment budget neutral in the sense that the total amount of money that's in play for the budget is decided by the Appropriations Committee. However much money you put out that they put out for general funds, state support special funds, working cash as a state support special fund, then that's it. And a member on the floor can't increase the total amount of money that will be spent, that is authorized to be spent by a floor amendment. They have to reduce another agency's budget. Well, there are problems with that. One is you don't have all the agencies' budgets together at the same time, because y'all know that y'all divide the bills into House-originated appropriation bills, half of them, and the other half are Senate-originated appropriation bills. And secondly, even for the House-originated ones, you're actually voting on an amendment to one bill that actually amends another bill that is not before you. So the rule is kind of awkward, but at least the amendment has to be drafted in that way. I tried to find an example. I've done a number of those, but they're hard to find unless you remember what member you did it for or what bill you did it for. But there is I'll call it a loophole, because I told you it's not binding through the whole legislative process. In other words, if a member gets an amendment in, it's not binding in conference. But the loophole is, and it was actually used by former Representative Cecil Brown the very first year of the rule, he offered a floor amendment to make an increase in a budget, and he decreased it by taking it out of the appropriation for Medicaid. We don't want to reduce Medicaid, and he said, this is just to get around or comply with the rule, Joint Rule 20A, but we know we're going to fund Medicaid. And so the way I've done it since then is the biggest one fund other than say the Department of Education has a huge amount of general funds, Medicaid has a huge amount, is debt service. And so I usually just say it'll be reduced by whatever amount you add by reducing the debt service by that amount, because we know the legislature is going to fund debt service. So it's kind of it is a loophole, and but basically we have members every year that say, I want a floor amendment. We've got plenty of money in the rainy day fund, the working cash fund. I want you to take $40 million, or say $20 million out of that, and I say, you can't do that. The the Appropriations Committee has not allocated any money out of working cash, and you can't do that without reducing another budget. And that was the reason that this rule was passed, is it was really to prevent floor amendments by people, popular floor amendments that you couldn't vote against, like adding $50 million to the Department of Ed appropriation bill, that everybody would have to vote for without reducing another budget. I told you the press has criticized it from the beginning, saying that the legislature in passing this rule has really, the rank and file have really restricted their ability to deal with the budget. If you're not on the budget committee, on the Appropriations Committee, you can't really add money to the budget without reducing another budget. You can't do a floor amendment that, whether it's popular or not, and even if everybody wants to do it, you can't add money from working cash or from some other bill. Probably it was adopted originally to prevent the people of the members of the minority party, at that time it was Democrats, from offering these. But in effect, of course, it applies across the board. It also restricts rank and file Republicans too. So whether it's good or bad, it does put the hands of the budget in the Appropriations Committee. This doesn't apply to amendments in committee, so whatever amount is set in the budget by the Appropriations Committee, that limits the total amount of state support special funds that are in play, so to speak. On the last page of this handout, this was in a bill this year, people ask me sometimes, what are state support special funds? The rule mentions a few of them, but a few new ones have been added, but budget contingency doesn't have much in it anymore. I think, doesn't the tobacco settlement go in there briefly? Okay, not much goes in that anymore, but capital expense, working cash, education enhancement, healthcare expendable, tobacco control, and the more recent ones, the BP Settlement Fund and the Gulf Coast Restoration Fund. And I bet we got a lot of other ones in 1353 that might need to be added to it at some point.
Well, they're not going to be state support. We're going to let them lose it and become special funds.
Very good. Very good. Okay. All right. Now we're going to get to some specific examples. And I've got them numbered here. I've got them stapled together. I've numbered, and I'll refer to them by number. And let's start with number one. And it's just a basic general fund, simple general fund appropriation bill. And so I'll point out the different parts and things that you need to, this is pretty basic, y'all will recognize that, but if you look on line 6, it's out of any money in the special fund. So there's the source. For the purpose of providing funding for addressing COVID matters. The fiscal year, it's July 1 to June 30th. The amount, the maximum sum, the payout clause, section 2. And this is one thing that sometimes we mix up, and what's happened some with ARPA funds. In the payout clause, you have to reference the same fund as in the appropriation section in section 1. If you look, it says from the state general fund, from the state general fund. And we did that. I did it. I know it caught it early, but I had done I used my general fund form that I showed you earlier, and I was doing ARPA funds, which we call them ARPA funds because that's the name of the federal law, but the actual fund it comes from is the Coronavirus State Fiscal Recovery Fund. That's the money that all the ARPA funds for the state go into. And I had forgotten to change it in Section 2, and it still said State General Fund. So you have to match up the reference in the payout clause to the actual appropriation in Section 1. All right, let's go to bill number 2, example number 2. Yes?
Why can't you just say any fund set forth in this act?
Any funds what?
Set forth in this act, instead of listing the exact fund.
I'm not sure how you would set it up.
Like out of any money, like set forth to the proper fund in this act. So not saying general fund, just saying whatever fund Section 1 is referring to.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about in the payout clause.
Yeah, because that's in a lot of the bills.
Yeah, you can do that.
Okay.
And I've got an example. For some people, I'm going to repeat Corbin's question just for the recording, but he said, why can't we just say out of the proper funds instead of listing the fund? He's talking about it in the payout clause because I had emphasized that you need to match up the reference in the payout clause. It's probably, when you have multiple special funds, which you do in Section 2. In Section 2, it's just the lump sum of all the special funds. And so you're not going to have the listing of all the special fund names. And so I'll show you in a second, but Corbin says out of the proper special funds. But for Section 1, and up front in the appropriation, you do have to name the particular fund. But I'll show you, yes, you're correct. On these simple appropriation bills, out of one fund, and then one fund in Section 1, and then the payout clause, I usually want them to be matched up.
Because I've messed up and done pull for the general fund on Section 2, and it's a different fund in Section 1.
Right, I've done that too.
That just helps
That's my,
me not having to remember to go back and change both sections.
yeah. Well, to me, it does save you time to say the proper special fund in Section 2 or the payout clause. I don't know. I don't want to say it's lazy, but it is just easy to do instead of paying attention to what you've got.
Efficient.
So I won't say it, but, Corbin,
It's efficient.
Huh?
Said it's efficient.
There you go. Okay. Hey, sure.
I want to say one thing that I didn't even know this really to the extent, probably the past 2 years. Ronnie's going over some of these appropriation bills that they actually do in the House LSO. Senate LSO doesn't typically do any additional appropriations. So for example, this one that he just showed at the bottom, Gwinnetta Tatum wrote it. I see her GT at the bottom. Corbin typically has to write a lot of those. I think in first house, your Senate LSO will do some, but then they walk away from it. So Corbin is always having to follow up and do. So it's just a little bit different in the House and the Senate how it's handled.
Yeah, for as long as I've been there, if a member came in and asked for an appropriation bill, we drafted it, and I've been told that's not always the case in the Senate. Now, I did learn what Leanne said. Initially, they will draft it, but the Senate LSO does not help with the appropriation bills from then on. Is that correct? Yeah. Well, we do. I mean, there are not many committee substitutes that we do because most of those are done by Debbie. But for floor amendments, for conference, some conference reports we do. But for the language, like for amendments, we do them. I mean, they come to us for amendments, and I do them, but I'm not the only one that does them. I've asked Gwinnetta over the years, obviously when one person does something a lot, they become more familiar with it and become sort of the so-called expert, but I've told Gwinnetta that we draft all types of bills, and we're not supposed to be thought of as specialists that only I can do appropriation bills, or only Bart Sperry can do bond bills or tax bills. And obviously he'll do them better, and I'll do appropriation bills better, but I have asked Quinetta to spread out the drafting of appropriation bills, and people get so intimidated by it because they've never done it. And I said, well, look, I'm going to review it before we put it out there, but you need to learn to do it. It can't be, we can't have it to where that if I'm not here, that nobody else can do it. We're all supposed to be able to do all types of bills. And a couple of years ago, well, actually it was in 2019, in the latter part of the session on Fridays, I met with some of our new attorneys who are not new now, but Aaron King and Mary Catherine Lindsay, now Sperry. But I met with them and just had tutorials with them every Friday afternoon. And we started with appropriation bills one week. We did bond bills. We did tax bills. We did local and private bills. We did, I can't remember if I said, local and private, I think I've said it. We did House rules and Senate rules for 2 weeks. And so, you know, those are things that people just get intimidated about. Oh, gee, I can't do a bond bill. I can't do a tax bill. Well, you can't do these complicated tax bills. I've been here a long time, and I can't do them like Bart can. I just don't have a knowledge of all the laws like he does. But I can do a basic one, and everybody ought to do a basic one. So we do them. I wish the Senate would do that. They may. They've had a lot of turnover in personnel, and they may need to, maybe a new leaf that they need to start learning how to do that. And, you know, we can help them in the House until they get, not throughout the session necessarily, but for helping them learn how to draft. And y'all too, I wanted to let y'all know, I can't review, just don't have the time to review all the conditions. You know, people, you'll probably after this presentation, you'll be more aware of it, and you'll come to me and say, well, how can I write that as a condition? I won't be able to review every one of them, but I want y'all to be thinking about that and keep that in mind, that you know, there are some constitutional limitations, and y'all do it a lot. I'll show you some that you've done that are in grafting, and I know, not criticizing you, it's just sometimes you just get caught where you have to do a lot of things in a short period of time. And you can't spend time analyzing each one. I can't either. But we do, particularly I do, work with the appropriation staff to try to get the language right. So just keep that in mind. I've worked a lot with Corbin and Rob, and some with Charlie and Deb and some others in the past. Okay, that was just some background. Look at Bill number 2. It's really similar to Bill number 1, except instead of having a long run-on sentence about the purpose, we will say on line 10, to be expended as provided in section 2. So then I can have the details in section 2. Now, it's still a condition, but the purpose I've put in section 2. So that was the main part of that one I wanted to show you. Let's look at number 3. This is a special fund appropriation out of any money in the state treasury to the credit of the state BP settlement fund. And then also the purposes are described in section 2. And if you look at the second page, it's to be used by the Board of Supervisors of Alcorn County for funding a remote worker incentive program to encourage people who are working remotely to work for companies in the county. Now, Corbin, if you look at that, I referenced the state BP settlement fund because there was just one fund here. But yeah, I mean, if you said the proper special fund, it would still work. All right, let's go to example number 4. And this is really more what you'll see in your agency funding bills, annual funding bills that you do during the year. You almost always have general funds and special funds in the bill. And the order is almost always, even if it's a smaller amount, to have the general funds in section 1 and then the special funds in section 2. And that's what these have done. If you look at line 7, out of any money in the general fund, and line 14, out of any money to the credit of the Department of Public Safety. And then, Corbin, again, you could look at the payout clause. I was more specific here, since it was one fund for the general fund and then money for the Department of Public Safety in Section 2, I specified both of them. This one might be one where it would be better, I mean, certainly easier just to say out of the proper special fund, because any money to the credit of the Department of Public Safety is not necessarily one special fund. They have multiple special funds, and if their purpose of the special fund would include purposes that this bill covers, then they could use those for that purpose. Now let's look at number 5. We saw a lot of these this year, ARPA funds. And I mentioned to you on line 6-7, the ARPA funds, all that go to the state, go in the Coronavirus State Fiscal Recovery Fund. And this is an example on line 9 and 10 where we're creating a new program and we're funding that new program, creating it in another bill this year, a general bill, and we're funding it through this appropriation bill. You see, we referred to it by bill number. Now, that bill ultimately died because they used a Senate bill, but actually it was taken and stuck in a bill right near the end in another bill that had another program in it, a general bill. But referring to, and this bill didn't pass, there was another one that passed. So the reference is being to a bill that died is not a problem. The bill that passed, the appropriation bill that passed, referred to the proper bill. But I wanted y'all to see two things. Three things. One is to see you funded a program that was established in another bill created this year, House Bill number 769, and then you refer to the session. But I wanted you to see section 2 and 3. This was Corbin developed this language based on the CARES Act language, and then he and I reviewed it at the beginning of the session and agreed we would try to put it in all appropriation bills, ARPA bills. Conditions on expenditure of the money to comply with the federal requirements, and also, if they don't spend it with the federal requirements, to be obligated to pay it back. So if you look at line 16, conditional language, the department shall not disperse any funds appropriated under this act to any recipient without first doing these. Now you notice it didn't have the word condition. There's not magic language where you always have to say condition. But you look in section 3, we did say condition. As a condition of receiving and expending the funds appropriated, the department shall do blah, blah, blah. Now we could have just said the department shall. That'd be pretty close to engrafting, in my opinion. You can't just direct an agency to do things. Again, in section 4, I was referring to the Coronavirus State Fiscal Recovery Fund. It's only one fund. When it's only one fund, I like to put the fund name in there in the payout clause. Let's go to example number 6. This is what y'all call it deficits a lot of times, and the agencies sometimes get defensive about that. They say it's not a deficit, we're not going to run out of money, and we know that, but a deficit, some agencies are running out of money, do run out of money. If you don't give them additional money, they will run out, but not all. Let's put it this way, all deficits are additional appropriations, but not all additionals are deficits. So you can have an additional without it being a deficit situation. So two differences. One is, if you look on line 13, for the period beginning upon passage of this act and ending June 30th, and on the last page, the bill itself is effective on passage. We also referred to a grant program fund. This one did pass in 1421, the Rural Water Association, so that's similar. And I didn't copy all the conditional language in section 2, but look at section 4 on the next page. None of the funds appropriated by this act shall be used to pay employee premium payments. Well, that's good conditional language. None of the funds shall be spent for that purpose. So that's constitutional language under section 69. And on the last page, as I already mentioned, the bill is for effective on passage. Oh, I did want to mention back on the first page, I said 18-month appropriation. Leanne and I talked about this. They needed an additional because the water programs were made effective on passage, I believe. All the others were July 1, ARPA programs. But instead of just doing the additional and then in one bill and then doing a separate one, either standalone or in the agency annual bill for the rest of the year, we just combined them both. And it's technically not 18 months. It depends on when it was signed, but it's more than a year. It's passage through the end of the next fiscal year, not just the current fiscal year. Okay? Let's look at example 7. I didn't copy the whole bill, but it's just the first page. You know, I showed you in the previous one, the period said for the period beginning upon passage of this act. This is an additional, oh, and I did want to point out, I underlined it in the title in the last one and this one, additional appropriation. You don't have to say in the body of the bill, but Leanne said that she and Sharon and others, you want to be able to track all the additionals, and if you put it in the title, and that's really for us, but if y'all remember too, us as drafters, to put an additional appropriation. But if you look on line 11, we backdated it. It's not passage, excuse me, I didn't copy the last page, but the bill is effective on passage. But we backdated it, and the reason for that is during the COVID session of 2020, the auditor questioned, it was probably by the way it was worded, it said to defray the expenses of the Veterans Affairs Board beginning upon passage and through June 30th. And the board wanted to spend it for expenses that they had incurred before the bill became law. And the auditor said, no, it's only for expenses before the effective date of the bill. And we said, no, we always say from the period beginning upon passage of this act. So anyway, Leanne and I talked about it. There are ways you could have done it, put some more language in, but the simplest way is just to backdate it to the beginning of the fiscal year. So you had bills in 2022 that were effective for the period beginning on July 1, 2021 and through the end of this fiscal year. Now, that's the easy way to do it. When I was asked on the previous one, on this so-called 18-month appropriation bill, and I said, if I backdate that to July 1, 2021, that's a 24-month appropriation bill, and I don't want that. And then I thought, well, I don't need to backdate it because there's no such program yet. There's no rural water program in effect yet. So there could not possibly be any expenses for that program before the effective date of this bill. So anyway, I went ahead and made that effective on passage, and internally I said for the period beginning upon passage of this act and ending June 30th. But keep in mind, we didn't used to do this, we shouldn't have to do it, but the auditor, we don't want him questioning it. If you think there's any possibility they're going to spend any of that money on expenses that were incurred before the additional appropriation was passed, you better backdate it to the previous, well, it's actually the current fiscal year because it'll be in the middle of the current fiscal year, but backdate it to the beginning of the current fiscal year and don't say for the period beginning upon passage of this act.
Ronnie, let me say one thing, and that's why we had to reappropriate the medical marijuana stuff, because we reappropriated it in y'all's bills for revenue and health because this was already a year appropriation. So we couldn't do a 2-year, so that's why we have to do
that was
like
split into 2 bills,
Yes,
and we were thinking about doing that on some of the others, and Leanne said, no, let's just make it an 18-month appropriation bill. It was ARPA funds, and we had made a decision at some point to keep the ARPA appropriations separate, which is unusual. I mean, you don't normally have as many standalone appropriation bills as you did this session.
Well, and we did do some ARPA appropriations in some agencies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, what I meant is this year is unusual in to have so many standalone appropriation bills that pass. I draft a whole lot of standalone appropriation bills that members ask, and not to discourage them because I explain it, but I tell them, you know, this bill is not going to pass. But I said, don't worry about it. It puts the bill in committee. Then you can constantly remind the chairman, I want you to put that in the bill for that agency when you do the annual funding bill for that agency. And that's normally what you do. You just roll it into the annual funding bill, and the separate standalone bill dies. But this year we had, I don't know, close to 15, 10 to 20. I don't remember how many finally passed.
I think we have, what, 130-something appropriations, straight appropriation
Oh,
bills?
it may be more than I
Yeah.
thought.
I thought it was like about, yeah, it's a lot.
A lot of them died though at the end.
Well, yeah, I think,
Some did.
yeah.
Okay, let's look at, I only copied the first page, but it's number 8, deficit appropriations for multiple agencies. Well, this one is kind of one that's done right near the end. Well, anyway, near the end. It's not necessarily right near the end. Sometimes it's done in the middle of the session, I think, Leanne. But if you look at the title, it's just a variety of agencies, and it tells you what fiscal year it's from. Some it's for the current fiscal year, some it's for the current and the next fiscal year. You know, this, I told you earlier, you shouldn't put multiple agencies in the same bill. This one would just be very difficult to have so many separate bills. So we just kind of ignore that part of Section 69 and put them all in one bill. But anyway, that's the I don't know what we call this, the big deficit bill, something like that.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
All right, so with our deficit, do we have a maximum time frame, the 18 months? Is that the rule, we can't exceed 18 months in a deficit?
No, it's technically not 18 months. For instance, if you pass one, say you pass it, say January the 2nd, and you make it effective on passage through the end of the fiscal year, that's going to be more than 18 months, right? Excuse me, if you make it through the end of the next fiscal year, like January the 4th, January 2022, effective on passage through June 30th, 2023. That's what I'm calling an 18-month appropriation bill. But it's more, well, maybe that is. Okay, maybe it is. That would be the full 6 months before, okay, that's right. Usually it'll be a little less than 18 months, not more than.
And so if we backdate it to the beginning of the fiscal year, say for instance, so section, Senate Bill 3055, you didn't print it out, but there's a section in here that has, it backdated to July 1, 2021 through December 31st, 2022, is section 9. And my question, I'm just trying to see, do we have like just an 18-month window? Because I know from the rule, the Constitution says we can't do it past 2 months after the.
Yeah, can you back up just a bit and repeat some of what you said?
All right, so section 8 of Senate Bill 3055 backdate from July 1, 2021 through June 30th, December 31st, 2022, I'm sorry, section 9.
Oh, it's through December.
Through
right?
December, that's right.
Yeah,
But
there's not a set limit of 18 months. That section of the Constitution just said no appropriation bill can be valid for more than 2 months beyond the end of the fiscal year at the next session of the legislature. So I guess, you know, I hadn't really thought about it. I guess a 24-month appropriation bill still would be okay because you're passing it this year. And really, you're not authorizing expenditures before the effective date of the bill. You're authorizing it to cover expenditures that were incurred before then. No, there's not an 18-month limit. You know, if we were concerned about it, we could split these two. I was looking at the one page that I had here for the AG. This is backdated on line 2022, but what I see in the title, some of these went from 2022 and fiscal year 2023.
Yeah, we split those in 2 sections.
Did you split them? Okay, good deal. Well, that's what I was going to suggest that you do, because you just, I don't know. It may not be a constitutional issue, but to show on its face a 24-month period, it probably shouldn't be done that way. You can have passage through the end of the next fiscal year, not just the current fiscal year, but if you backdate it, you probably ought to split it. Split the first one to the current fiscal year, backdated to the beginning date, July 1 of the current fiscal year, and then have the second one effective July 1 of the upcoming fiscal year through the end.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Again, we didn't have to think about that until the auditor had that objection. All right, example number 9. This is similar to the others. It's the purpose of expenditure, but I just wanted you to see that they can be line items. If you look at page 2, they are line items by purpose and amounts. And when you look at them, they look like, if you didn't know better, you would say those are appropriations. Well, they are purposes of expenditure. If you look at the lead-in language on 13 and 14, the money appropriated by Section 1 of this Act shall be expended for the following projects. So those are purposes which are allowed under Section 69. Those are conditions. I'll clarify later that the Supreme Court said there can be partial veto, though didn't used to be. But anyway, just you can see conditions can be set out as line items. Okay, the next 3 we're going to look at, or 3 or 4, are actual bills that passed, annual funding bills, and this is the non-controversial Board of Cosmetology. They're always controversial. I've been here for many decades, and it doesn't matter who's there, who's the head of it, who's on the board, they're always controversial. But if you look at line 11, I would have said appropriated instead of approved for expenditure there. Of the funds approved for expenditure, the following positions are authorized. And Leon, I wanted to ask you, first time I've seen the word head count instead of positions. Is that, what's the reason for that?
So with the new SEC 2, they wanted to flip to head count rather than authorized pins. So we're no longer, and then we're not going to have any part-time positions. So for
Okay.
example, if an agency has 100 head count, 10 of those could be part-time rather than full-time. They can make those decisions.
Okay, but we're not going to have these unfunded pins?
Nope, we have
Actual
done away with
heads,
that.
actual heads, right?
Actual heads.
Okay. Okay, but that's the conditional on the pins, or the head count now. If you look on the next page, none of the funds herein appropriated shall be used in violation of blah, blah, blah. Well, that's conditional language, good conditional language under 69. Now here, and actually I don't go back and look at the bills, I did not realize that this has been in there since 2014. It's a great condition precedent. I wrote it for Charles Young. It passed. It stayed in. And who does cosmetology? Who? Anna? Okay. At some point, I need to show you how to update this language. It looked like what happened is every year, that's on line 57, it said 2014 in the year it first was enacted, and it kept getting updated until 2019, and then it was not updated after that. But to be fixed, you don't just need to update that. If you look at that, because I want you to look at it, this is a condition precedent. This does not have to do with expending the money, except it says you don't get the money unless you do this. That's what you use to make an agency do something, and yet what you're making them do doesn't necessarily involve spending the money. It said that they could not get their money until they adopted policies that they would not issue licenses for the practice of wigology, and a policy that allowed persons who held a wig specialist license by a certain date to continue to operate. Well, presumably they did that in 2014. You don't need to have them adopting a policy every year. So what you do, once they've done it, you could say none of the funds can be spent unless they maintain that policy that they adopted in 2014. But this is a good example. Not many of these pass and stay in the bills. It's usually a way for a member to try to get a floor amendment to try to talk about something they want to force the agency to do, but it usually fails. But this one, I did not realize that it stayed in the conference report. But anyway, it can be fixed pretty easily, and but the way it's written now, 2019, it probably, if you were going to update it, it should have said 2022. Now, why does it say October 1? I started drafting some condition precedents, and I said none of the funds can be spent until the agency has adopted a program and implemented this program. And then I thought, well, what if this passed? That would mean on July 1, they'd already have to do the program, it'd have to be implemented, or they can't spend $1 of their money. So I tried to write it somewhat more realistically and give them time to do the policy. So that's why I said they can't spend the money until after a set date. It could be October, it could be November, something like that. But if you just say the agency cannot spend any of their money until they do something, and whatever they're doing might take several months to do, then you're not doing a realistic conditional appropriation. Y'all are not going to be asked very often to do those in what y'all do, but you might. Let's flip over to page 5 in that bill. Here's the first of intent conditional language. It's the intent of this legislature to provide the funds for the board to meet when necessary, but under no condition shall it meet more than 62 days a year. Of course, like I said, the intent of the legislature is not engrafting, but it's not binding either. And this could probably be rewritten to say that none of the funds can be spent by the board for meeting for more than 62 days a year, because they're going to be paying the per diem and expenses to the members for meeting. It's the intent of the legislature that the board shall maintain complete counting and personnel records. Well, could you rewrite that as a condition? Maybe, but it's okay to say the intent there. On the next page, it's the intent that the agency's budget request shall be submitted. Well, if you just said they shall do it, is that engrafting? Well, it probably would be. It would be engrafting on section 7 if you didn't have the intent of the legislature. You just said whenever 2 or more bids that they have to give a preference. That doesn't have to do with a condition on expenditure. And section 8, I think it's put in a lot of the bills that they shall not incur expenses in excess of their obligations. Now, Corbin, here's what you were talking about. Section 9, out of the money, appropriate of any money to the credit of the proper special funds as set forth in this act. So that works fine there. Let's look at some more conditional language in number 11. This is for DEQ. This one is also very common in that you see a general fund appropriation in section 1 and a special fund appropriation in section 2. And when I was trying to standardize the language in appropriation bills many years ago, I was trying to say any money to the credit of the agency, and I said which is comprised of special source funds collected by or otherwise available to the department. So, I mean, there could be a number of special funds. They may have one main special fund, but they have a number of smaller special funds. All right, on the next page, of the funds appropriated, the following positions are authorized. That's good conditional language. You flip over on the next page, line 53, none of the funds, we've already seen that in the other bill. Same thing in section 4 on the intent conditional language. Flip over to the next page. Now this is I don't know how to make this how to make this condition. It shall be unlawful for any officer to use any motor vehicle, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's just declaring something to be unlawful, illegal. And that is engrafting general law. Maybe you can think about it and see that none of the money appropriated in this bill can be used by anybody for using a vehicle that's not owned by the state of Mississippi. So it probably could be reworded as a condition, But just keep in mind, when you say it shall be unlawful, or the agency shall do this or shall not do that, if it doesn't deal with the expenditure of the money, it's engrafting substantive general law onto the appropriation bill. And see, it was attempted to be softened by, it's the intent of the legislature that motor vehicles shall comply with those code sections. I didn't underline them, but if you look at page 7 on line 144, these are proper conditions. Well, actually, these says the money shall be derived from a certain fund, but if you look at section 10 of the funds appropriated under section 2, a certain amount is provided for the Clean Water Grant Match. If you look at section 11, it's very detailed, and it's in grafting. If you look at it, the department may request, but then it says they shall do this, they shall do that, they shall suspend processing of the permit applications notwithstanding the provisions of a code section. And I don't know if that could be written as a condition. Again, I'm not trying to be critical. Y'all are asked to do these things by members, and they're not ineffective. Unless somebody sues to try to stop this from being done, as in grafting, then it still gets done. Now that's not to encourage you to engraft wholesale, but some of these things don't cause as much of a problem as it might seem that it would. And especially when you're asked to do something like this, you pretty much have to do it. Now, if you have it, and sometimes Corbin or Rob or some others, Deb, have asked me earlier in the session, now if I'm asked to do it on the spot, it's harder to do it. You say, well, we're going to be doing this. Can you work this into a condition for me, or help me work it into a condition? Then a lot of it could be probably worded as a condition, which would not be engrafting. If you look at section 12 and 13, again, intent of the legislature. Now, you look at section 14, of the funds appropriated herein, it's the intent of the legislature that the DEQ shall pay debt service on bonds. Now, and it's done on section 15. Now, I mentioned earlier, if you're talking about the expenditure of money, you don't have to soften it. You don't have to say it's the intent of the legislature. On section 14, of the funds appropriated, DEQ shall pay. That's a condition. You don't have to use the word condition in there. That's pretty clear. And then section 15, it's the intent of the legislature that from funds available, the agency may purchase. You don't have to say intent of the legislature there. That's authorizing purposes for expenditure. You can see in section 18 of the funds appropriated in section 2, a certain dollar amount's provided for a purpose. That's a valid condition. You look on the next page, section 19, with the funds appropriated herein, DEQ is authorized to make payment to certain vendors. Those are line items, but those are clear conditions, valid conditions. And then section 22, out of the proper fund or funds set forth in this act, because you've got a number of different special funds. Okay, let's look at example 12. This is Medicaid. And if you look at section 9 on the second page that I've included, the governor's office shall provide statistical and financial reports on a monthly basis. Well, that's pretty innocuous, but it's still engrafting. You're ordering them to do something. Shall perform its cash flow projections. Well, that deals with money, but it's not expenditure of the money. Now look at section 10. That's a good condition. Of the funds appropriated under the provisions of this act, an amount not to exceed $2.75 million is provided for the purpose of funding a temporary program. And that's been in there for several years, probably 15 years now. Same thing, good condition on section 11. On section 12, of the funds appropriated, no more than a certain amount, or a stated amount, or not less than a certain amount. All those are good conditions. If you look on section 14, on line 260, the division and the coordinated care organization shall establish baselines. Well, that's engrafting. It might be could be rewritten as a condition, have to think about it. Some more examples in example number 13. This is for wildlife. Look at section 5, page 2. Each conservation officer and supervisor shall be furnished an allowance for uniforms not to exceed $500 per annum. Well, I put in grafting, and it probably would be better to say of the money appropriated, they shall be furnished. But the more I thought about it, it might not be. You're still, I told you, you don't need magic language to say when something's a condition. If you're establishing the purpose for which the money can be spent, it's a valid condition. So this may be fine the way it is. The fact that it says shall be furnished an operating allowance, I thought, well, I mean, uniform allowance, I thought maybe it might need to be reworded a little bit, but it may be okay. Now, again, if you look on same language in a lot of bills, section 10 on line 213, just declaring it's unlawful to do something about the motor vehicles. Looks like these are very similar. Look over on line 258. We get asked a lot of times, well, can't we just create that special fund in the appropriation bill? No, you can't. That needs to be done by general law, and that's what was done here. This was already created, but it says shall be treated as a special trust fund. Now, if you want to do that, you have to amend section 49.521 to say that. All funds derived from licenses, et cetera, shall be deposited in the fund. All revenue shall be deposited in an account. All that's general law that should be done in a general bill. Y'all might have been asked to do that. That's the only bill available you had, but just keep in mind that is engrafting. Look on line 287. It's the intention of the legislature that no state park be closed without legislative approval. Well, of course, it's the intention of is not binding, but you could reword that to say that probably the condition precedent. You can say the Department of Wildlife shall not be authorized to spend any funds appropriated, if they close any state park. Well, they better not close any state park. You would accomplish what you want. You see what the difference is? It does the same thing, but it doesn't just declare that something be done or say they shall or shall not do something that's really general law or substantive. Now I copied a lot of this, but I don't have to look at it. Example number 14, this is the one I was telling you about, what Rob would call the correction transfer bills. It doesn't really do a lot of transfers, but if you look at it, it's amending an existing law that passed in the 2021 session. And if you note, I noted down at the bottom, it's marked a G1/2. It's a general bill. And you flip over to line 32, you can see that dollar figure was changed. That's just the amount that can be spent for a certain budget. It did not increase the total authority of spending. Section 2 amended, it didn't amend the whole appropriation bill, it amended section 2 of it. But if you look over on the next page, apparently somebody got the wrong name of the championship that was being funded. So that was one of the things that needed to be changed. And at the bottom, they wanted capital expense funds to be spent. And on line 171, the name of the program was wrong. And so you can flip through and see some other underlining. There was just some corrections really to make these projects work. The information they gave us was wrong. It wasn't necessarily any staff person's fault. We put in what we have. But keep in mind, this is a general bill. If there are errors implies that somebody made a mistake. But if there are things that need to be corrected, we would do it in this bill, and it's a general bill. Let's look at the next one, transfers. We've mentioned transfers. This is the big transfer bill this year, one of the biggest. But it was one of the ones that we set aside at the beginning of the session for this purpose, and I underlined in the title some of them. a whole bunch of transfers. I've noted at the bottom of page 1, it's a general bill. All right, I underlined just a couple of them, but let's flip over to, because they're all the same, flip over to line 187. This is the one that everybody's interested in, top to bottom, Democrat, Republican, in crowd, out crowd, whatever. These are the projects that they got allocated for them, and it is pages and pages and pages. And we're going to have to come up with some other way to letter them, but you know, when you have A, and then you have double A, and you have quadruple A, we're up to 12A. I don't know what you'd call it. 7 is septuple, octuple. I don't know what 12 is. But you have to count, you know, to make sure you're in the right one. Anyway, we have that many projects. Now, what's different about it this year is a few years ago, those projects were done in a bond bill. And the bond bill, you have to pay interest on it. So last year, a bunch of them were done in DFA's appropriation bill out of capital expense fund, a long list of them. And there was some talk about doing that this year, but we decided, the leadership decided we have so much money in capital expense that we don't need to borrow money when our bank account is flush. Let's just pay for it as we go. So we pay for it from transfers from the capital expense fund and from the BP settlement fund. We get $40 million a year for that, from that, and fund it from this new fund that was created called the Local Improvements Projects Fund. And so if you look, line 188, the state fiscal officer shall transfer the sum of $20,800,000 from the state BP settlement fund. Well, I got ahead of myself. Section 17 is the big chunk of it from capital expense, is $201 million. Those two sums together are the money that was appropriated in DFA's appropriation bill to actually fund the projects. These transfers do not fund the projects. Keep in mind, transfers are within the Treasury. They don't authorize money to be spent out of the Treasury. Now, flip over to, it's line 564. Now we saw the transfer. This is the special fund that didn't exist before, but it's also created in this fund, this bill, the Local Improvements Project Fund. So it didn't have any money in it when it was created, but now it has over $200 and something million. Money deposited in the fund shall be dispersed by DFA as follows. And I listed a few of them, but as I told you, it goes up to, it's about 150 to 200 projects. How many, Ava? 200? Yeah, close to 200 projects, at least 180 something. Yeah, I've seen it, yeah. Okay, now, some of the controversy, potential controversy, is the governor doesn't like the fact that he can't partial veto general bills. And last year, when the projects were in the capital expense, in DFA's appropriation bill, he partial vetoed 2 of them. And under his newfound authority that he got by the state Supreme Court in 2020, when Speaker Gunn and Speaker Pro Tem White sued him over some partial vetoes over the CARES Act. We have heard, and he has to vetoing them. This is not an appropriation bill, it's a general bill. If he does it, it's not authorized by law. I think it's pretty clear. There was a case back in the 90s where Governor Fordyce tried to partial veto a bond bill, and the court said, Supreme Court said, no, a bond bill is not an appropriation bill. Well, a general bill is not an appropriation bill either. Let's do this last one. I'll talk a little bit more about the partial veto. But this is what I'm talking about. That's not appropriated for the local projects. The funding, the spending authority that we've been talking about is not in 1353. It's in 3045. This is DFA's appropriation bill, and Leanne put the lump sum, or Leanne Corbin, I don't know who did it, but y'all both had your eyes on it. The lump sum for those local projects and some of these other special funds that were created and transferred in 1353 is in the lump sum for special funds on line 16. And if you look at, this is not these projects, but some projects were put in DFA's appropriation bill. If you see, there's a valid condition on line section 29. X amount, 39.9 million, is provided for these purposes. Now, under the state Supreme Court case, Governor Reeves can partial veto these because they're in an appropriation bill. Before 2020, he could not do that. But look at section 30. That's what I wanted you to look at. Of the funds appropriated in section 2, 388 million shall be derived out of the following special funds. And capital improvements, community colleges, state agencies, those would have been done in a bond bill this year. Those are done through transfers in parts of 1353 and then appropriated here. But on line 432, the local improvement project fund, it makes it clear that the lump sum in section 2 includes the appropriation for the local improvement project fund. So the evidence is clear that the appropriation is in 3045, not in 1353. So we'll see. We'll see if the governor pushes the limits and sees how far he can go. I did want to mention a little bit more about the partial veto. All right, we read in section 73 that the governor has the authority to veto parts of appropriation bills, and until 2020, December of 2020, parts of appropriation bills did not include conditions, and it didn't matter if the conditions had dollar figures in it. And I showed you several conditions where they look like appropriations. They list line items, they have purposes, they have dollar figures, and lay people and lawyers arguing for the governor said that those are appropriations. Well, the court had said previously in the 90s in their own case that no, those are conditions, even with dollar figures in it. But in 2020, the court said those are separate, distinct appropriations that can be partial vetoed. The case was not very well reasoned. They didn't explain why they're not following their own case from the 90s. But just keep in mind, if you have a line item or a dollar figure in a condition in an appropriation bill, it can be partial vetoed by the governor now. Previously, if it didn't have a dollar figure, even if it had a dollar figure, it could not be partially vetoed. So we know he can't veto bond bills, partial veto bond bills, because that was settled in the 90s, unless the court reverses itself in a later case. But the governor, partial veto authority does not extend to general bills. If you don't like it, you have to veto the whole thing. You can't veto a section, you can't veto a line item, you have to veto the whole bill. He could veto the line item of the appropriation for the local projects, but he would be vetoing all the local projects and have the wrath of all the members come down upon him. So we think there's a good chance he will try to partial veto it, unconstitutionally in our opinion. But let me mention too, when the governor does something, well, when anybody does something that's unconstitutional, unless they get challenged and told to do otherwise, it still is good, I guess. I'll put that in quotes. It's effective, I guess is the word. If if the governor partial vetoes some projects in 1353, do you think DFA is going to pay those projects? And not just because the governor appoints the head of DFA, but I mean, that's part of it. But, you know, you got a declared partial veto if the governor does that. So anyway, we will see what happens on that. That covers everything that I had planned to cover. Leanne had asked, do y'all have any specific examples y'all brought? Any questions, hypotheticals, you know, that we can comment about? Because this is a writing workshop.
I do have one question.
Yeah.
Okay, going back to the bill for cosmetology,
Okay. Which item?
it's House Bill 1584, looking at item section 3, where you're talking about the policy and how we could probably update the dates from 2019 to 2022. At some point for an agency, if it looks like it's becoming like a standard, at what point would it move to general bill versus just being a condition in an appropriation bill? Is there any point that it would become that?
Well, you say move to a general bill. Somebody has to put it in a general bill and it has to pass. I mean, this could have been done in a general bill initially. Okay. That could have been done in a general bill in 2014. Charles Young might have done that. I can't recall right now if he had a general bill to do it. But when the agency's appropriation bill came up, he said, here's my opportunity to do it. What I had mentioned earlier is the fact that if you have a condition precedent and once you get it in there, I assume that they did that or they couldn't spend any of their money in 2014. Because it gave them, in 2014, it gave them, not in this bill, but I looked it up, it was actually in the 2014 appropriation bill. And so presumably the agency did that or they couldn't have spent their money in 2014. So, you know, you normally think about updating the dates every year, but here you're requiring them, I mean, this language would require them every year to adopt a policy every year. I guess it still works because if they've already adopted it, then, you know, they're maintaining that policy. I think, though, that once you know they have it, you could just say that, and you wouldn't have to have a date in it up at front. Maybe those dates that I've underlined 2014 might need to stay in there back to the original 2014 date when it was included. But you could just say none of the funds can be spent by the board unless they maintain that policy. See, once the policy's been adopted, and we assume they did or they couldn't spend their money, then the policy's still there. And as long as they maintain it, they can spend their money. Those dates there on 65 and 66, I think what happened, the language of wig specialist and wigology got taken out of the general law a long time ago. And I thought, frankly, that they didn't have any people that did that, but apparently they were still issuing licenses for those people. And so they wanted to say that they would not issue any more licenses, but they would still let the people who already had the licenses continue in operation. And that's why they put those July 14 dates in there.
Ronnie, can I say something? This
Yeah.
is when y'all read your bills at the beginning of the session before we go through, these are the things we need to make sure if it even needs to still be in there. I'll take full recognition of 2019. I was the budget officer, so I missed rolling a date forward. But every year for something like this, and there's some other ones I've seen now that I didn't realize were still in some of the bills because I haven't read all the bills lately. You need to double check with your subcommittee chairman and your agency. And I know a lot of y'all have done that, and we've shifted budgets around pretty regularly for new eyes to look at it. So this is probably one of those we need to find out if they did the policy, if they maintain it, and it's probably a good way to write that going forward.
Yeah, that's a good thing to do, is to review the bills in the interim when you don't have the pressure of it, and see, you know, are there problems with it, or sometimes it's just obvious there. Why, obvious it's something, why is it 19? You know, that would be a question that somebody would ask, but sometimes there's not an obvious reason. But just read over it. That's what I kind of got into back in decades ago, when the committee assistant just said, do you want to look over those bills? If you have any changes, let me know. Well, I was not really involved with the language of appropriation bills then. I drafted standalone appropriation bills for our office, but it gave me an opportunity to look through them and see inconsistent language and language that just didn't seem to make sense. And so I would do those. I did those for several years. And so y'all are the ones working with it. Y'all can do that. And, you know, you can ask Leanne, and if she has a question, or y'all can ask me directly too, but if you have any problems about some, or questions or concerns, I guess, not necessarily problems, just let me know, or let Leanne know too. And then if we, you know, need
Yeah, because a few
lawyer
years
to look at
ago,
it.
yeah, because Ronnie pointed out to me a few years ago about the deficit language. And so in the interim, he worked on it over the summer, and I just had to incorporate it into my last year when I was the budget officer. So now we've got pretty standard deficit language. I think it was effective dates and some other stuff that we had gotten a little
Right.
not as structured. So anybody have any other questions?
An additional appropriate, like addition to the appropriation? So like,
Let's see. The question is about additionals and saying of the funds?
Yeah.
What?
so like, I know some of it's not with everybody's agencies, so some agencies have like section one, and then another section that says like an in addition to section within their bill.
Oh, yeah. That happens occasionally. I don't see it every year and every,
Like DFA is a good example.
yeah.
It's got like four.
No, I know what you're talking about now. What it is by far most of the funds are covered and included in lump sums in Section 1 of general funds and Section 2 special funds. But particularly on some of these longer bills, you go through and you've already had your pay raise or pay language and head count, and then just kind of out of the blue, it says, in addition to any other funds appropriated, X amounts appropriated to this agency for a particular purpose. Nothing wrong with doing that. It used to be, before the Supreme Court opinion in 2020, that was the type of, that was the only type of an appropriation bill that could be partial vetoed. You had to cut out a part of the bill that didn't affect any other part of the bill. But clearly, you could have taken that sum, included it in the lump sum, and made it a condition instead of an additional appropriation. You could have done it that way. But now the governor could veto it either way, because they can veto conditions that have dollar amounts. But think about it. If you had the lump sum increased by the amount of that appropriation, and you just said, of the funds in Section 2, $10 million shall be used by this agency or may be used by this agency for a particular purpose, that's a condition. And if the governor strikes out that section, the governor has no authority to rewrite and reduce the lump sum in Section 2. So the court had previously said that if you take out a condition, you, by necessity, impact the other parts of the bill because you can't rewrite the lump sum. So that meant you couldn't do it. The governor can't veto conditions, and he can't veto appropriations in an appropriation bill if, by taking it out, it affects some other part of the appropriation bill. So those were the only type of appropriations that the governor could use partial veto authority on. And so I discourage people from writing it that way, if you thought that it was risky because it could be rewritten as a condition, and up until December of 2020, the governor could not use his partial veto authority to veto the conditions. Well, now it doesn't matter. He can veto it either way. But is your question, is there anything wrong with doing that, or just, there's not. A lot of times you think about something, I say you think about it, they want something that's decided later in the process, and you just stick in another section. In addition to the money appropriated in this bill, there is appropriated X amount to this same agency for this purpose.
I just wanted you to kind of talk about it. 'Cause
Okay, well, I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did.
It's not in every
No, it's not.
bill, so.
Well, and part of the reason we typically do that now, most of y'all know, is because the legislature wants to track that one individual piece. So at
Okay.
DFA, the in addition to sections, so that we'll have a budget request. Because the way it was always explained to me of, in addition to, you now have a budget number. Otherwise, it's just a program or a line or something that the agency has to
Okay.
do.
So, yeah, there's a purpose to it that I didn't know about, so there is a reason for. I'm glad to learn. I always want to learn, every day, or every week anyway. Anyway, I covered a lot, I know. For y'all that are relatively new, you've seen it. You've seen all of it, but you may not know how it fits in to the whole scheme of things, or how the different parts and aspects of appropriation bills work together with general bills. But you can see, like I said, that they're a special type bill, and there are certain things you can do with them, certain things you can't. They do become laws when they're passed, but you just can't do everything in them that you could do in a general bill. You can do a lot of things in them. There are ways to write things as conditions to make things work, even though the general bill might be better. There's some things you just can't do by conditions. Yeah, a couple of things I wanted to mention. One is that general bill that I showed you that we're calling the transfer corrections bill, where we're amending current fiscal year appropriation bills to make corrections. If you don't increase the total amount authorized for expenditure by the agency, then it's a general bill. But if you do increase the total amount authorized for expenditure, it is an appropriation bill. So if you wanted to provide more money for an agency, the typical way to do it, by far the most common, is to do an additional appropriation. You could go back and amend the previous year's appropriation bill and increase the spending authority there. There may be some other tracking issues it might not be good for doing that way, and I've never seen it done that way. I can't say never, but it's just not done that way. You know, when you want to do it, you do an additional. Something I was going to say about the conditions. I lost my train of thought on that. Well,
It'll come back to you.
think of it sometime, not now.
Is anybody, I know it's almost lunch, and I know we all appreciate it. Portia, you have another question?
I have like 3 questions.
Okay.
One is for clarification. Did I hear you say when you were talking to Corbin that the governor can't veto appropriations, a line item appropriation, if it affects other parts of the appropriation bill?
That was the case. That was the situation before the court decision in December 2020. The name of the case is I've forgotten which name, Reeves versus Gunn. And Gunn and Jason White sued the governor, and they won at the trial court level, and he appealed it. That's why his name is first on the appeal. But, Portia, before that case, there were very few circumstances that a governor could partial veto a bill. It had to be a self-contained provision that when it came out of the bill, it did not affect any other part of the bill. And so when I say affected, you could take it out, but it may take that entire section out, like the ones Corbin were talking about, a separate standalone additional appropriation within the bill, but that money, if that money was included in the lump sum, and it was not written as a separate standalone appropriation, but instead said, of the funds appropriated in Section 2, $10 million shall be spent for this purpose. That's a condition. It's still a condition, but the court said that that's also a distinct appropriation that can be partially vetoed. Even though the words appropriation are not used with it, even though the lead-in says of the funds appropriated in Section 2. So, I mean, like I said, the court opinion was not reasoned very well. Those do not appear to be appropriations, but whether it's poorly reasoned or not, it's the law of the state now. And so if you have a dollar figure in a condition, whether it's a line item or whether it's a section that says of the funds appropriated in Section 2, $10 million shall be used for blah, 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 the governor can strike that out.
Okay. And it is good until he's challenged, right, is what you said?
That's right.
Okay.
And I'll point out one other thing, too. In 2020, 2 legislators sued him. In the Fordyce case in the 90s, 3 legislators sued him. But in this recent case, they narrowed it. Legally, it's called standing, but it's who has the right to sue. And they said the legislature can't sue anymore. They don't have an interest in their bills, seeing that their bills are upheld. The only people that have the interest are the people who would receive the money. So the only people that can sue if he strikes out a project now are going to be the recipients of the project money. And a lot of times the project money, I say the project, but the conditional language is to a state agency who the governor appoints the head of that agency, so you know that they're not going to sue the governor. But on some of these, like some of these expenditures, projects from capital expense, or if he vetoes this, tries to partial veto this general bill, 1353, we're already thinking ahead. The legislators cannot sue him anymore, but the recipients of the projects could sue him. And it probably needs to be brought to court and decided, because if the if the governor can just strike through anything he wants because it has a dollar figure on it, he's going well beyond partial veto of an appropriation bill. I mean, appropriation bill has a number of characteristics that distinguish it. And 1353 has none of those, except it's just listing some projects that have dollar amounts. And it does not say they're appropriated. The appropriation is clearly in Senate Bill 1345. But we'll see. Got a few days, 2 days, we'll see.
All right, and then my last question is, going back to Joint Rule 20A. I know you gave an example, and when you were going through it, I had an example as well. One of the members tried to increase appropriation and by decreasing something, like the Department of Health Rural Water. Take out $200 million and increase or give every member a project $2 million, or however it was worded. But anyway, you mentioned that you must have the amending bills before you. And when you say that, say we reduce the health department's ARPA bill by $200 million, and we want to put it in the transportation bill, for instance. Does that bill, what does that mean when you say it has to be before you? Does it have to be on the calendar? Does it have to have been passed or not passed already?
Well, what we have, the way we've interpreted that is it would cover bills that are still in the House. Like if we're dealing with House-originated bills, any bills that are still in the House, and this is where it gets really kind of far-fetched, any Senate bills that are yet to get to the House. And that's what people say, how can you possibly amend a bill that's not even in the House yet? But the bills that are no longer before you, they're either before you or are going to be before you. If you've already passed them and released them to the Senate, you cannot reduce those bills. Now, if you look at the rule, I didn't want to belabor it too much because it doesn't work really. But if you read the provisions of it, it says how it works. I mean, how it is implemented. For instance, the amendment says, okay, we increase the amount by X amount. And it says, to comply, at the bottom I put a paragraph saying, to comply with Joint Rule 20A, the debt service appropriation bill shall be reduced, and I give the bill number if I have it at the time, reduced by $20 million. Well, that's a Senate bill. It's always been a Senate bill. So when it comes over to the House, the rule says we're supposed to reduce that bill by $20 million when we get it here. So, and if it's a House bill that we haven't yet released to the Senate, it says that it will be reduced to writing as an amendment by the House, not by a member. Then the bill is reduced before we send it to the Senate. We've never gotten that far where it's ever been done, but you can see how it's just a problematic rule because you don't have one bill before you. But the leadership wanted it done, and I did the best I could in writing it to make it work, but there are a lot of problems with it. So it's never been done. I don't know that any amendments have passed. I don't think any have ever passed that haven't. So, you know, because if somebody wants to do something against the leadership has the votes to defeat it. So you can't really get around it very easily. So. Any other questions?
Thank you, Ronnie.
Okay.
Ronnie has
You're welcome.
the most historical knowledge, and you can listen to him for hours. So we appreciate you bestowing some of that knowledge on us as well.
You're welcome. I was going to tell you, one of the reasons I wanted it recorded is because my director, Gwinnetta Tatum, keeps telling me she wants to learn about appropriation bills. And every time I go to her office, she gets a phone call or a text or a member that drops by, and she can't focus on it.
All right, you realize we're still recording.
That's fine. So anyway, I thought, this is great. Gwinnetta, you're going to come to me to this meeting. And then Thursday, she said, oh, management committee meets today at 10 o'clock. So I thought, okay, Leanne, can we record this? And she said, yeah. And then I said, you know, depending on how well it works out, you could use this for any new staffers, and I wouldn't have to come and talk to one person for 2 hours. So anyway, so hopefully you'll learn something. Appropriation bills are interesting. They're the main ones that you work with, but you can see there are more intricacies to them than some people might realize. So anyway, if I can help y'all, let me know. I do encourage y'all to read over your bills that you handle. Think about them now that you have had this background, and just think about, should that be changed? Is this still good? Because you've seen the language in your bill. A lot of times it's just repeated from year to year. You start with the current year's fiscal year bill for next year, and you start with that, and those provisions stay in there. Somebody asked about shouldn't that go into the general law? Well, if you get something in an appropriation bill, it can only be good until the end of the next fiscal year, 2 months past it. But if you keep putting it in the bills from year to year, it becomes a de facto general law, even though it's not the best way to do it. So anyway, we'll end on that. Thank you all. Appreciate it.